The phone rang just as Robert Hayes was mopping up the water that leaked from his kitchen pipe again. He let it ring twice before sighing and reaching for the receiver. "This is Robert. Mr. Hayes." "This is Janet from Grant & Morrison Law in Denver," a calm professional voice said. "I'm calling regarding Linda Parker Hayes." The name hit like a brick. He hadn't heard it spoken out loud in 15 years. "What about her?" he asked quietly. "I'm very sorry to inform you that Mrs. Parker Hayes passed away last Tuesday. The funeral will be this Friday, and you've been listed as a beneficiary in her will." For a second, the world shrank to the sound of the dripping faucet. Beneficiary. That couldn't be right. Linda had built her empire long after their divorce. What could she possibly have left him? That evening, Robert sat at his small dining table staring at the phone. The coffee beside him had gone cold. Through the thin walls, his neighbor Mrs. Wilkins was yelling again about her flooded lawn. Life went on even as something inside him cracked open. The next morning, he called his son. "Ethan, it's about your mother," Robert said. "I know," Ethan cut in. His tone was clipped efficient the way Linda used to sound when she ended meetings. "The funeral's on Friday, and yes, I heard you're invited. They said I was in her will." Ethan laughed. "That's probably a clerical mistake, Dad. Don't get your hopes up. You'll get nothing." Mom knew exactly what she was doing. Robert said nothing. The line went dead, but when the lawyer opened the folder at the reading of the will, Ethan's smile disappeared. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Morning light crawled through the blinds of Robert Hayes' small apartment in Fort Collins, Colorado. The air smelled faintly of dust and black coffee. He moved slowly, every motion deliberate, the ritual of a man who had learned to make peace with silence. The kitchen clock ticked louder than usual. He reached for the same chipped mug he'd used for 10 years and poured himself another cup. Through the window, he could see his neighbor, Mrs. Wilkins, standing on her porch, arms crossed. "Your sprinklers are flooding my lawn again, Robert," she yelled across the fence. He lifted a hand apologetically. "I'll fix it, Mrs. Wilkins. Just a loose valve." "It's always a loose valve," she muttered, retreating inside. Robert smiled faintly. That was their routine, her complaints, his quiet apologies, the rhythm of small-town coexistence. But this morning the world felt heavier. He sat down at the small dining table, the sunlight landing on a framed photo of Linda and Ethan, taken 20 years earlier at Rocky Mountain National Park. Ethan was 10 then, grinning with missing teeth. Linda stood beside him in a red hiking jacket, confidence shining in her eyes. She always stood like that, Robert thought, like someone who knew exactly where she was going. Now she was gone. He rubbed his temples, the lawyer's voice still echoing in his mind. "You've been listed as a beneficiary in her will." That word again. Beneficiary. It didn't make sense. Linda had turned her consulting business into a corporate empire after the divorce. She'd been on the cover of business magazines, quoted in articles about women in leadership. She had no reason to remember him, let alone leave him anything. Robert rose from his chair and walked to the bookshelf. He opened a small wooden box, the only keepsake he had never been able to throw away. Inside lay a few letters, a dried wildflower, and a photo of Linda taken the year they met. Her hair had been darker, then her smile unguarded. Flashback, Boulder, 1987. It had been snowing lightly that evening. Robert, then a 28-year-old electrician, had stopped by a diner after work. That's when he heard a woman's voice rise from the counter. "You're telling me you don't hire women for the night shift because they can't handle pressure? That's ridiculous," the manager stammered, caught off guard. Robert turned, and there she was wearing a red coat, eyes sharp, fearless. She argued like a lawyer, every word cutting through the smoky air. Robert had never seen anyone like her. When she finally stormed out, he found her business card left behind on the counter. Linda Parker, business consultant. He memorized the number before he even touched his pie again. 3 days later, he called. "Hi, this is Robert Hayes. We haven't met, but—" "You're the guy from the diner," she said, her voice amused. "The one who tipped generously after watching me scare a manager half to death." "That's me," he admitted, smiling. "Would you consider having dinner with someone who admires good arguments?" She laughed. "Depends. Do you plan on losing them gracefully?" That was their beginning. Back to present, 2025. Robert sighed, closing the box. He could still hear her laugh. For all their fights later, she had once been the most vibrant part of his life. He looked around the apartment, the sagging sofa, the faded curtains, the hum of the old fridge. It was quiet, but it was his. Janet's voice from the law office replayed in his mind. The funeral will be this Friday, followed by the will reading. He hadn't been to Denver in years. Too many memories, too many ghosts. At noon, he stood in front of his closet holding up the only suit he owned, a gray one from his son's college graduation. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar and old regret. He brushed the dust off and laid it across the bed. When he looked in the mirror, the man staring back was older than he remembered. His hair had gone silver, his hands rough from decades of repairs. He tried to imagine what Linda would think if she saw him now. Would she feel pity or guilt? He sat back down, staring at the photo again. "You were always chasing the horizon, Linda," he murmured, "and I stayed behind fixing what you left." The next morning he packed his things, a pressed shirt, an old tie, a half-used bottle of cologne. Before leaving, he checked the sprinkler one more time. It still leaked. Mrs. Wilkins watched from her porch. "Going somewhere fancy?" she asked. "Just Denver," he said. "Business or pleasure?" He smiled without humor. Neither, just unfinished business. The drive south took nearly 2 hours. The Colorado sky stretched wide and merciless blue against the dry plain. Robert turned off the radio and let the road hum beneath his tires. Traffic signs blurred into a rhythm of white lines and thoughts he couldn't quiet. He remembered their last fight, the one that ended everything. Linda had missed Ethan's graduation for a client emergency. Robert had waited furious. But when she walked in at midnight still on a call, he'd said family has to come first sometimes. She'd looked up from her phone, eyes hard. "Everything we have exists because I work. You think money grows from your sentimentality?" He'd wanted to yell, but instead he said something worse than "maybe we have nothing left worth saving." 6 months later, the divorce papers arrived. He hadn't spoken to her since. By the time he reached Denver, the afternoon light was starting to fade. Skyscrapers glowed orange in the sunset. He stopped at a gas station on the city's edge, washed his hands in the restroom sink, and stared at his reflection once more. "Don't expect anything," he muttered. "You're just saying goodbye." Back in the car, he adjusted the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, he thought he saw Linda's reflection there, young, determined, untouchable. The highway curved, leading toward downtown. Sometimes the past doesn't die. It just waits for you to come back. Would you forgive someone who left you behind for success? Downtown Denver rose ahead like a monument to everything Linda had loved: order, ambition, control. Glass towers caught the dying light, throwing gold shards across the street. Robert felt small inside that glittering canyon of success. He parked 2 blocks from Riverside Memorial Chapel and sat for a moment, engine idling. Around him, people in suits hurried past with phones pressed to their ears, faces lit by blue screens. He wondered if Linda had looked like that in her final years, always moving, always busy, never still. He stepped out, the cold evening wind tugging at his jacket. His shoes clicked against the sidewalk, echoing between the walls of marble and steel. He passed a billboard for Parker Consulting Group, Linda's company. Her name, Linda Parker Hayes. Founder and CEO shown in bold letters above the skyline. Robert stopped. For years he had avoided these reminders, pretending her world didn't exist. But here it was towering over him, proof of everything she'd built without him. He couldn't decide if he felt pride or shame. At a red light, he glanced at the reflection in a storefront window. The man looking back at him was older, humbler, but still standing. Maybe that was enough. He whispered to himself, "You chased the world, Linda. I just tried to hold on to ours." The light turned green. He crossed the city, swallowing him in its glow. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about who was right. It's about who remembers. Would you forgive someone who left you behind for success? The first years with Linda were simple. They lived in a rented house on a quiet street in Boulder, the kind with a porch swing and a small garden that never quite bloomed the way she wanted. Robert worked long hours as an electrician, and Linda freelanced as a consultant for local businesses. Money was tight, but laughter came easily. In those days, Linda still talked about dreams with a kind of reckless hope. Over dinner, she would spread papers across the table, sketching business ideas on napkins. One day she told him, "I'll build something that matters." Robert smiled. "You already have," he said, pointing toward their son Ethan, asleep on the couch with a toy truck in his hands. but ambition once awakened doesn't rest. When Ethan turned 5, Linda registered her company Parker Consulting. At first it was just her and a second-hand computer. Within 2 years, clients filled their mailbox. Her voice, once warm and playful, became sharper, trained for negotiation. The dinner table turned into a workspace. Just one more call, she would say, headset on, as Robert cleared the dishes alone. He didn't mind, at least not at first. She was building a future. But he started to notice the silence, Ethan eating breakfast, alone drawings left on the fridge that Linda never commented on, holidays shortened because of urgent projects. One night, Robert came home from a repair job to find Ethan sitting on the living room floor waiting in pajamas. "Mom said she'd be back for bedtime," the boy said. "Can you read instead?" Robert nodded, his chest tight. "Of course, buddy." As Ethan drifted to sleep, Robert glanced at the framed wedding photo on the mantel. Linda's smile in that picture was brighter than any chandelier she'd later own. He whispered, "You were supposed to build with us, not away from us." The company grew. So did the distance. By the time Ethan was 12, the house had changed: granite counters, tall ceilings, glass instead of wood. Linda called it progress. Robert called it noise. She started inviting clients for dinner, turning their home into a showroom for success. The conversations revolved around profit margins, partnerships, and the language of ambition. Robert, who spent his days climbing power poles and repairing wires, sat through these dinners feeling invisible. "Jerry works with the utility company," Linda would explain when guests asked. Her tone was polite, but hollow, the same way someone might mention an outdated appliance that still functioned, but didn't fit the decor. After one dinner, Robert confronted her in the kitchen. "You sound embarrassed of me." Linda didn't look up from her laptop. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm just trying to make a good impression." "On who, them or yourself?" She sighed. "Robert, not everyone is content being ordinary." He had no answer for that. Ethan grew fast and faster, still grew the distance between father and son. The boy admired Linda's world, the sharp suits, the sleek office, the constant motion. Robert represented something slower, softer, outdated. When Ethan turned 15, Linda threw him a party that could have doubled as a corporate gala. A catered buffet, a live band, printed invitations. Robert suggested a backyard barbecue, something warm and simple. "That's not who we are anymore," Linda said. The night of the party, Robert stood in the corner of their gleaming living room, feeling like a guest in his own house. Business associates mingled under chandeliers, complimenting Linda on her vision. Ethan moved through the crowd with the awkward confidence of a teenager pretending to be an adult. At one point, Robert found him alone by the pool, staring at the water. "You okay, son?" he asked. Ethan straightened, forcing a smile. "Sure. Mom says these people are important. Maybe. But you don't have to impress anyone tonight." The boy shrugged. "That's easy for you to say." Robert wanted to reach out to remind him that family mattered more than image. But Linda appeared behind them, radiant in a silver dress, a glass of champagne in her hand. "Everything all right here?" "Fine," Ethan said quickly, slipping back into the party. Robert watched him go, then looked at Linda. "You've built something beautiful," he said quietly. She smiled. "I know." Later that night, the guests left, leaving behind the echo of expensive laughter. Robert sat outside on the porch, the mountain air cold against his skin. Inside, the lights from the living room still glowed, illuminating empty wine glasses and crumpled napkins. He lit a cigarette he hadn't touched in years and stared at the stars. Somewhere between love and ambition, something essential had died. That night he realized love can't survive in a house built for ambition. The rain started just as Robert stepped out of his car. It wasn't heavy, just enough to turn the pavement slick and make the city smell like metal and memory. Riverside Memorial Chapel stood ahead, tall and elegant, with stained glass windows that glowed faintly against the gray afternoon. Expensive cars lined the circular drive: Mercedes, Teslas, a polished black BMW with a vanity plate that said ETH N1. Robert tightened his old overcoat and walked toward the entrance, his shoes squeaking with each step. Inside, the air was cool and perfumed with lilies. Conversations hushed to a murmur as he entered. People turned their eyes, flicking over him, his worn shoes, his outdated suit, his presence. He found a seat in the back row. From there, he could see the crowd, at least 200 people, all dressed in black that looked custom-tailored. He recognized some faces, former business partners of Linda's people, who had once come to their house for dinner when success was still a novelty. But now their glances carried something sharper: judgment, curiosity, maybe pity. At the front, a large photo of Linda rested beside her casket. She was smiling in it, the same confident tilt of her head she used for magazine interviews. The caption on the memorial program read, "A visionary leader, a woman who built an empire." Robert stared at that word, empire. Funny, he thought, how no one ever calls love an empire. He folded his hands, trying to disappear into the wooden pew. The eulogy began: speeches from colleagues, friends, people who had known her brilliance but not her warmth. Each sentence sounded like a press release. Linda Parker Hayes transformed the consulting industry. Her leadership inspired countless women in business. Her legacy will endure. Not one mentioned the smell of her hair after rain or how she used to hum Sinatra while washing dishes. Robert bowed his head, whispering under his breath, "You deserved better than this kind of goodbye." The sound of footsteps broke through his thoughts. A voice followed, sharp, familiar. "Dad!" He turned. Ethan stood in the aisle, towering, immaculate, in a black suit that probably cost more than Robert's car. His hair was styled perfectly, his tie silk, his watch gleaming. But his eyes, those were Linda's. "What are you doing here?" Ethan's voice cut across the chapel like a blade. People turned. "I came to pay my respects," Robert said quietly. "You lost the right to do that 15 years ago." Robert didn't answer. The whispers started, then soft, poisonous. "That's her ex-husband. I can't believe he showed up. She wouldn't want you here," Ethan continued, his voice rising. "You embarrassed her enough when she was alive." The funeral director shifted nervously near the altar. The minister froze mid-sentence. 200 eyes locked on the scene like theater, only crueler. Robert stood, his voice steady. "I'm not here to make trouble. I'll sit in the back. When the service ends, I'll leave." "You'll leave now," Ethan snapped. "You don't belong here. Not after everything." Robert met his gaze. "Everything," he repeated softly. "You mean raising you while she built her dream? Fixing the roof, paying the bills, holding things together until she decided she was done pretending we were a family?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "You were never enough for her. You settled for mediocrity. She outgrew you." For a moment, Robert almost smiled. "Maybe she did," he said. "But I loved her for 40 years. That's more than most people ever manage." The chapel fell silent. Even the rain seemed to stop. Ethan stared at him, unprepared for calm instead of anger. Then he scoffed, shaking his head. "Unbelievable." He turned toward the crowd, addressing them like a keynote speaker reclaiming a stage. "I'm sorry for this disruption. My father seems to have forgotten that divorce means you're no longer family." A few polite nods from the audience. Sympathy for the son, discomfort toward the man in the back. Robert felt his pulse slow. There was no winning this moment. He simply sat back down. The minister cleared his throat and continued the service. Through the prayers, Robert watched Ethan, his perfect posture, his flawless composure, and wondered where that little boy with the toy truck had gone. When the ceremony ended, people lined up to offer condolences. None approached Robert. He waited until the crowd thinned, then rose to leave. The rain had stopped, but the air smelled heavy, like it might start again. He was halfway to the exit when a voice stopped him. "Mr. Hayes." He turned. A man in his 50s stood near the front pew, holding a leather briefcase. His suit was expensive but not flashy, his manner calm, practiced. "Daniel Grant," the man said, offering a hand. "Grant and Morrison, LLP. I handled Mrs. Hayes's estate." Robert hesitated before shaking it. "I suppose you mean Linda's estate." Grant nodded. "Yeah, I'm sorry for your loss. Mrs. Parker Hayes was formidable. That's one word for her." Grant gave a sympathetic smile. "There's a matter we need to discuss. The will reading is scheduled for 4:30 today. You're named in it." "I was told that," Robert said. "I still don't understand why." "Perhaps it'll make sense soon," Grant said. "Your son will be there as well." Ethan approached. Just then, his face still tight with anger. "Dan," he said, his tone flipping instantly from hostility to charm. "Good to see you. I assume this won't take long. It'll take as long as it takes." Grant replied evenly. "Your mother was precise with her instructions. Both of you must be present." Ethan frowned. "Both?" He gestured toward Robert. "Is that really necessary?" "It's required by law," Grant said, "and by her express wish." Robert wanted to protest, to say he didn't need to be part of whatever spectacle this was, but something in Grant's tone stopped him. "All right," he said finally. I'll come. Excellent, Grant replied. My office is a few blocks away. We'll walk. Outside, the city lights flickered against the wet pavement. The three men moved in silence through downtown Denver, Ethan leading slightly ahead, Grant in the middle, Robert trailing a few steps behind. The sound of their footsteps echoed between the buildings. As they crossed the intersection at 17th and Blake, Robert looked up at the skyline. Somewhere out there her office still existed, Parker Consulting Group, glass-walled and relentless, the empire she'd built. He wondered if her spirit was watching this strange parade of men, one who loved her, one who admired her, one who tried to become her. When they reached the office building, Grant held the door open. After you, gentlemen, Ethan muttered under his breath. Let's just get this over with. Robert stepped inside last. The elevator doors closed, and in the mirrored reflection, he saw the three of them standing side by side, the past, the present, and the reckoning. The elevator ascended in silence, its mirrored walls reflecting three faces that shared only history and exhaustion. Ethan stared at his phone, pretending to scroll, his reflection a perfect mask of control. Daniel Grant adjusted his tie, his expression unreadable, the calm mediator between two storms. Robert stood slightly apart, watching the numbers climb, 2, 5, 7, 10. Each ding sounded like a countdown to something inevitable. He remembered the last elevator he'd ridden with Linda. It had been years ago at a conference in Aspen. She was nervous before her keynote speech, pacing and fixing her notes. He had reached for her hand then, and she'd smiled just once before the doors opened. That small moment, ordinary and fleeting, had felt like victory. The elevator stopped with a soft chime. The doors slid open to reveal the law office, polished wood floors, golden light spilling through tall windows, the faint smell of leather and paper. Everything here felt curated, timeless, like Linda herself had designed it. Ethan stepped out first, shoulders squared. Robert followed slowly, feeling the air tighten around him. For 15 years he had lived quietly, fixing other people's homes, while his own past crumbled in silence. Now, fate or Linda had dragged him back into the empire he once tried to escape. He exhaled, steadying himself. Whatever waited behind that office door, it would change everything. Daniel Grant's office smelled faintly of polished wood and old books. The walls were lined with framed degrees and photographs, handshakes with mayors, charity galas, a lifetime of respectability. Sunlight slanted through tall windows, pooling gold across a mahogany desk that seemed built to bear the weight of secrets. Please, have a seat, Daniel said, gesturing to two leather chairs. Ethan immediately claimed the one nearest the desk. Robert took the one beside it, slightly off-center, as though the space itself reminded him where he stood in this family. Grant opened a large folder, the paper crisp and precise. This is the last will and testament of Linda Parker Hayes, executed March 15th last year. Robert's breath caught. So recently, had she known she was dying, or had she simply wanted to make peace with her empire while she still ruled it? Ethan leaned forward, impatience practically radiating from his expensive cologne. Let's just get to it, Dan. Grant adjusted his glasses. Very well. He began to read in that calm, deliberate tone that lawyers use when words are meant to alter lives. To my beloved son, Ethan Parker Hayes, I leave the family home at 1290 Hillcrest Avenue, along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal property contained therein. Additionally, I bequeath to him the sum of $500,000 to be transferred from my primary investment account within 60 days of probate. Robert glanced at Ethan. The young man's expression was smug, almost bored, as though this had been a foregone conclusion. The Hillcrest property was worth over $1.5 million in cash, was hardly trivial. But then Grant continued. These bequests are subject to the following condition, that Ethan Parker Hayes remain employed with Parker Consulting Group for a minimum of 2 years following the date of this will's execution, or until such time as the company is sold or dissolved. Ethan frowned, the first crack in his composure. Conditions? Grant nodded. Your mother was quite specific. That doesn't make sense, Ethan said, forcing a laugh. Why would she put something like that in writing? I already run half the operations there. Grant didn't answer immediately. Perhaps she wanted to ensure continuity, he said neutrally. Robert sat still, listening to the tension tighten the air like a piano wire. Ethan straightened his tie, recovering his charm. Fine, whatever, I can handle a few years. Just move on to the next section. Grant turned the page, his tone shifting subtly as though bracing himself. To my former husband, Robert Hayes. Ethan's head snapped around. Grant continued. I leave the remaining balance of my estate consisting of all investment holdings, personal accounts, and controlling shares, 65% ownership of Parker Consulting Group and all its subsidiary entities. The room went silent. Outside traffic hummed faintly, the only sound in the world still functioning normally. Robert blinked. He thought he'd misheard. I'm sorry, he said slowly. What did you just say? Grant looked up from the document. You are the primary beneficiary of Mrs. Parker Hayes' estate, Mr. Hayes. That includes approximately $33.5 million in assets and controlling interest in the company. Ethan laughed a sharp, disbelieving sound. That's ridiculous. She'd never do that. My mother built that company with her own hands. She'd never give it to him. Grant didn't flinch. I understand this is difficult news, Mr. Hayes, but I assure you the documentation is sound. Robert felt the floor tilt. The numbers didn't make sense. 33 million. Control of Parker Consulting. It was absurd. There has to be some mistake, he murmured. She couldn't mean me. Everything has been verified and notarized, Grant said. Your former wife was of sound mind and full legal capacity when these documents were prepared. Ethan slammed his hand against the desk, the sound like a gunshot. No, this is fraud, Mr. Hayes. She was manipulated, Ethan shouted, turning toward Robert. You did this. You got to her somehow. You must have called her when she was sick, convinced her you'd changed. You've always been good at playing the victim. Robert stared at him, stunned. I haven't spoken to your mother in 15 years, he said quietly. Liar, Ethan, Grant said sharply. That's enough. No, it's not enough, Ethan shouted. She built everything, every brick, every dollar while he sat in some apartment fixing sprinklers. And now you're telling me she just gave it all away? Grant's calm voice cut through the storm. Your mother underwent a full psychological evaluation prior to signing. She insisted on it precisely to prevent disputes like this. The report confirms she was entirely competent. Ethan laughed bitterly. Competent? Then she must have hated me. Robert finally found his voice. She didn't hate you, son. Don't call me that. Ethan's voice cracked under the weight of rage. You don't get to call me that. Robert fell silent. Ethan pointed a trembling finger at him. You walked away. You left her when she needed you most. You left us. And now you're cashing in on guilt. I didn't want any of this, Robert said softly. I didn't even know she was sick. She wasn't. Ethan barked. She was fine. She was. He stopped realizing what he was saying. The denial twisted his features into something almost childlike. Grant leaned back, letting the silence speak. Your mother made her choice, Mr. Hayes. She believed this distribution reflected her wishes. Ethan spat. To humiliate me? No, Robert said quietly. To forgive me. The words seemed to hang there, impossible and heavy. Ethan stared at him, breathing hard. Forgive you. For what? For holding her back, for ruining her life, for leaving, Robert said, and for letting her go when I should have fought harder. Ethan shook his head, tears of fury in his eyes. You think this makes you some kind of hero? You think inheriting her company wipes away everything you weren't? No, Robert replied. It just means I have to face everything I was. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Ethan grabbed his jacket, his voice low and shaking. This isn't over. I'll contest it. I'll drag this through court for years if I have to. Grant nodded solemnly. You're within your rights, but I'd advise you to read the competency report first. It's airtight. She anticipated this. Ethan's laugh was hollow. Of course she did. She always planned for control. He turned to Robert. Enjoy your empire, old man. You didn't build it, but you'll destroy it just the same. He stormed out the door, slamming behind him. The echo lingered, vibrating through the paneled walls. Robert sat perfectly still, staring at the papers on the desk. The words blurred together, legal phrases, financial figures, the language of a world that had once rejected him. Grant cleared his throat. Mr. Hayes, are you all right? Robert exhaled slowly. I don't think so. She wanted you here for a reason, Grant said gently. She left something else for you, a personal message. I'll give it to you when you're ready. Robert nodded, though he barely heard him. His thoughts were elsewhere in the past, in a quiet kitchen, in the sound of a woman laughing, while rain hit the windows. The empire she'd built had finally returned to him, but it felt nothing like victory. He whispered, "What were you thinking, Linda?" Outside, the city hummed with indifferent life. Inside, Robert sat beneath the warm light of an office that smelled of legacy and loss, trying to breathe under the weight of $33 million, and one unanswered question: why me? The office was quiet long after Ethan's footsteps disappeared down the hall. Daniel Grant sat behind his desk, hands folded, waiting. Robert hadn't moved since his son left. He just stared at the empty doorway as though Linda might walk through it any second and laugh at the absurdity of it all. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "Mr. Hayes," he said gently, "there's something else your wife left for you. For both of you, actually." He opened a drawer and retrieved a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. Across the front, written in Linda's unmistakable looping script, were the words, "For Robert and Ethan." Robert's throat tightened. "She wrote that, yes," Daniel said. "She delivered it herself 2 months before she passed. She insisted it be read after the will." Robert nodded slowly. "Then go ahead." Daniel took a breath and carefully broke the seal. He unfolded the letter, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. Then he began to read aloud, his voice steady but softer than before. "My dearest Robert, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in Daniel's office wondering if the world has lost its mind. I can picture you now pretending to be calm, jaw clenched the way it always does when you're trying not to argue. I know this inheritance must feel wrong to you. You probably think you don't deserve it, but you do. You deserve every penny, and more importantly, you deserve peace. I never stopped loving you, Robert. Not during our fights, not during the divorce, not even during the 15 years of silence that followed. I was angry, furious really, but it was never because you failed me. It was because you reminded me of everything I'd failed at. You begged me to slow down, to look around at what we were building together. I told myself you were afraid of my ambition. But the truth is, I was afraid of your simplicity. Afraid that you were right, that success meant nothing without love. I left you to chase validation from the world, and the world applauded me for it. But applause fades. Your steadiness never did. When I got sick last year, I had time to think. Too much time. I realized that every award on my shelf, every dollar I earned, came from the foundation we built together. You gave me the courage to start. I gave you nothing back but excuses. So this is me trying to make it right in the only way I still can. The company, the money, it's all yours now. I know you'll use it for good. You were always the one who understood value better than I did. You valued people." Daniel paused, glancing up. Robert sat motionless, tears slipping silently down his cheeks. "Keep reading," he whispered. "And to my son, Ethan," the letter continued. "I know you're angry right now. You probably think your father manipulated me. But sweetheart, this was my decision and mine alone. You've spent your whole life trying to prove yourself to me, to the world, to an image I created for you. You've been successful, but you've never been free. You grew up in boardrooms and hotel lobbies, not playgrounds. You learned to win, not to live. And that's my fault. I built a cage and called it opportunity. You've inherited enough to live comfortably, but not enough to stay comfortable. Use that gift wisely. Build something from nothing, the way your father and I once dreamed of doing together. Learn patience, learn kindness, learn to fail. Because failure, my love, is the only thing that teaches us who we really are. I hope one day you'll forgive me and forgive him. We both made mistakes. We both loved you more than we knew how to show." Daniel's voice softened. "If this letter reaches you both, I hope you'll find each other again. Not as enemies or competitors, but as two men who loved the same woman in different ways. Remember, this love doesn't die when people do. It just changes shape. I'll be watching quietly as always, hoping you both finally find the peace I never had. Goodbye, Robert. Goodbye, my boy." He folded the letter with reverence and set it on the desk between them. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The ticking of the wall clock seemed deafening. Robert reached for the letter, his fingers trembling. The paper was warm from Daniel's hands, but it felt like it still carried Linda's touch. He ran his thumb along the signature Linda and closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, he saw her face as it had been when they first met, laughing, alive, unbreakable. and for the first time in 15 years, he smiled without pain. "She forgave me," he said softly. Daniel nodded. "And herself, I think." Robert exhaled a long breath that felt like the first one he'd taken in years. "She always said she'd build something that mattered." He looked up, eyes shining. Maybe this was it. He folded the letter carefully, sliding it into his coat pocket. "Ethan needs to read this." "I can deliver it," Daniel offered. Robert shook his head. "No, it should come from me. If there's even a small chance he'll listen, I owe him that much." He stood taking one last look around the office. The golden light from the windows had softened into evening. Outside, the city glowed cold and beautiful like a crown she'd left behind. Robert turned to the door. "Thank you, Mr. Grant." Daniel smiled faintly. She was a remarkable woman. She was, Robert said, but in the end she remembered how to be human. He walked out into the corridor. The floorboards creaked under his steps, the sound echoing softly like footsteps on memory. At the elevator, he paused and looked down at the letter again. The wax seal had broken cleanly as if it had been waiting. "She was gone," he whispered. But somehow she came home. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. He stepped inside, clutching the letter to his chest as if it were a heartbeat. When the doors closed, his reflection looked different, not older, but lighter. The kind of man who'd finally put down a burden. Would forgiveness ever heal 15 years of silence? The next morning, Denver was wrapped in a thin mist that blurred the skyline into shades of silver. Robert sat at his kitchen table, the same letter lying open before him, the paper softened by fingerprints and tears. He had read it 3 times already, yet the words still felt unreal, like a message from another lifetime that had somehow crossed the distance between heaven and regret. He poured himself coffee, though he barely tasted it. On the counter sat the keys to his car and a folded business card Daniel Grant had handed him the night before Parker Consulting Group executive access. The title made him uneasy. He wasn't an executive. He was a man who fixed things that broke, who understood circuits, not shareholders. But Linda's words kept circling in his mind. "You'll use it for good. You valued people." By 9 o'clock, he was standing in front of Parker Consulting's headquarters. The building loomed like a monument to ambition, 40 stories of glass and steel that reflected the gray morning sky. For a moment he almost turned back. Then he whispered, "One last repair job," and stepped inside. The receptionist looked up confused. "Can I help you, sir?" "My name's Robert Hayes. I have an appointment with the board." She hesitated, scanning her computer. "You're Mr. Parker Hayes's husband, ex-husband," he corrected gently. "But yes, apparently I own the place now." The woman blinked, unsure if he was joking. "Right, I'll notify them." He waited by the elevator, watching his reflection in the mirrored doors. He didn't look like someone who controlled millions. He looked like someone who'd come to apologize. The boardroom was an enormous, polished oak table. 12 high-backed chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. 4 executives sat waiting, their expressions polite but guarded. A 5th seat at the head of the table remained empty. Linda's seat. "Mr. Hayes," said a woman with short silver hair, "I'm Karen Whitmore, Chief Operating Officer. We were all surprised to learn of Mrs. Parker Hayes's decision." "I was too," Robert said. Another man, tall and sharp-featured, spoke. "With respect, sir, are you planning to sell your shares?" "We have investors calling already. They're concerned." Robert took a breath. "I'm not selling." That caused a stir. Papers rustled. Someone muttered something under their breath. "I don't know much about consulting or markets," he continued, "but I know what this company was supposed to stand for. Linda started it to help people to make business more human. Somewhere along the way, it turned into something else." Karen leaned forward. "Sir, Parker Consulting is worth hundreds of millions. We have responsibilities, shareholders, clients." "I understand," Robert interrupted softly, "and I'm not here to destroy what she built. I'm here to remember why she built it." They exchanged glances. The tall man scoffed. "With all due respect, that sounds sentimental." Robert smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I've spent my life fixing wires that carry light. I figure people aren't that different. You patch what's broken, or the whole system goes dark." The room fell silent. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade. He looked at Linda's empty chair. "Success without conscience," he said quietly. is just expensive failure. I think you all know that. For a long moment no one spoke, then Karen nodded slowly. What do you want us to do, Mr. Hayes? Start with transparency. Fair contracts, real mentoring programs, bring back the scholarships Linda used to sponsor before expansion cut them. You're serious, the tall man said, half incredulous. I've never been more. Before anyone could respond, the boardroom door burst open. Ethan stood there still in his funeral suit, his eyes burning. You had no right to come here. Robert turned toward him. Morning, son? Don't morning me, Ethan snapped. You're humiliating her memory walking in here like you belong. I didn't walk in, Robert said evenly. She left the door open. You're ruining everything she built. Robert's tone stayed calm. Maybe she wanted me to fix what she couldn't. Ethan's laugh was sharp and bitter. Fix it. You think this place needs your repairman philosophy? This is business, Dad. Real life. Robert took a step closer. Real life? Real life is watching your wife burn herself out trying to prove something to people who stop caring the moment the market dips. Real life is losing the person you love because neither of you knew how to slow down. Ethan's jaw tightened. You wouldn't understand. I understand more than you think, Robert said quietly. Because I spent years being angry just like you. Angry at her for leaving, angry at myself for letting her. For a heartbeat, Ethan looked like he might crumble. Then he shook his head. You're pathetic. Robert didn't flinch. Then help me do it right. Ethan froze. What, you think I can run this company alone? I don't. But maybe together we can make it mean something again. Ethan stared at him, caught between fury and disbelief. You're asking me to work for you? No, Robert said. I'm asking you to work with me. The silence between them stretched thin. Outside, the clouds broke sunlight spilling through the glass and across Linda's chair, the light warm and fleeting. For an instant, Robert could almost see her there, watching them both, her eyes soft, proud. Ethan glanced at the chair too, his throat moving as he swallowed. You don't know what you're doing, he muttered, but his voice had lost its edge. Maybe not, Robert admitted. But I know what I'm not doing anymore. I'm not walking away. Ethan turned toward the door. His hand lingered on the handle for a moment as though something inside him wanted to stay. Then he left without another word. The room emptied slowly after that. Karen shook Robert's hand, promising to support his reforms. When everyone was gone, he crossed to Linda's chair and stood behind it. On the desk was a photo he hadn't noticed before, Linda and Ethan at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, both smiling. Her handwriting was on the frame, "Build it right." He traced the words with a fingertip. I'm trying, he whispered. I'm still building what we started. The city stretched out below sunlight, scattering across glass towers. The empire was hers, but for the first time it didn't feel like a monument to loss. It felt like a second chance. Robert sat in her chair, closed his eyes, and let the light wash over him. A week later, the office felt different, quieter. The framed photo of Linda still sat on the desk, her handwriting beneath it. Build it right. Morning light spilled across the wood, warm and patient, like forgiveness taking shape. Robert had started coming in early, long before the rest of the staff arrived. He liked the stillness, the hum of the city waking outside the windows. It reminded him of the power plant mornings from years ago, machines waiting for a spark, a pulse to bring them alive. He was reviewing a stack of reports when the receptionist knocked. Mr. Hayes, a courier, just dropped this off for you. She handed him a thick envelope stamped in red, notice of will contest, filed by Ethan Hayes. For a moment, Robert didn't move. The sound of traffic below filled the silence. He broke the seal, carefully unfolded the pages, and read. The language was clinical, all legal terminology and numbered clauses. But between the lines he could hear his son's voice, hurt, pride, confusion. Everything Linda had tried to mend. He sighed and leaned back in the chair that used to be hers. Outside, clouds drifted slowly over Denver's skyline, their shadows crossing the city like passing doubts. He's fighting me, Robert murmured. Maybe that's the only way he knows how to talk. He picked up Linda's letter from the corner of the desk, the edges already worn from rereading. Setting it beside the legal notice, he whispered, maybe this is how healing begins, through conflict. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock. Robert rose and walked to the window. The sun was setting behind the mountains, gold streaks fading into violet. He rested a hand on the glass, his reflection merging with the city lights. Voices fade, he said softly, but guilt echoes louder. He turned off the lamp, leaving the office in half shadow, and stepped out into the hallway, into whatever came next. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to Echoes of Betrayal. Thank you for watching.